Buongiorno a tutti, io sono Alberto Mingardi, direttore dell'Istituto Bruno Leoni. 10 anni fa, l'8 di aprile, moriva Margaret Thatcher, primo ministro del Regno Unito per 11 anni che hanno cambiato veramente il volto di quel paese, figura controversa, amatissima da alcuni, al contrario, tutt'oggi veramente odiata, profondamente odiata da altri. Uno di quei leader politici che fanno la storia anche nel mondo delle idee, che segnano un prima e un dopo rispetto ad alcune questioni cruciali, tra cui quelle più care all'Istituto Bruno Leoni, che riguardano cioè il bilanciamento tra Stato e mercato, la separazione tra economia e politica, rispetto alla quale Thatcher ha veramente fatto la differenza. Una cosa la più banale: prima della signora Thatcher la stessa parola privatizzazioni non era di uso comune, perché si aveva esperienza solamente di nazionalizzazioni, cioè di passaggio di imprese private nelle mani dello Stato e non invece viceversa. Oggi vogliamo ricordare la signora Thatcher assieme a un amico che l'ha conosciuta veramente da vicino. John O Sullivan è il fondatore e oggi il presidente del Danube Institute a Budapest, dove dirige anche l'Hungarian Review. È stato il direttore della National Review, il più importante periodico, il più importante giornale del conservatorismo americano, fondato da Bill Buckley. Ha scritto molti libri, tra cui uno, Il Presidente, il Papa e il Primo Ministro, in cui si parla proprio della fine della guerra fredda nel segno di queste tre figure: il Presidente Reagan, Papa Giovanni Paolo II e appunto la signora Thatcher. E della signora Thatcher è stato consulente e speechwriter, cioè per un certo periodo di tempo in qualche modo l'ha aiutata a trovare le parole giuste per esprimere la sua linea politica, il suo approccio alle questioni più rilevanti dell'agenda. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Alberto. It's nice to talk to you again.
Well, I just wanted to ask you to begin with, so that our audience is more acquainted with these basic facts. How long have you worked with Mrs. T, and how did you get to know her right at the beginning?
Well, I got to know her right at the beginning because I had a furious row with her at a lunch when she was the Minister of Education. I was the only, it was a lunch of journalists and sketch writers, and I think I was the only person apart from herself in the room who was a conservative. The rest were all quite hostile on the left. And I asked her a question about educational vouchers, and she dismissed them as absurd. She was, of course, in a government headed by Edward Heath, who was obviously.
So this is the early 70s.
This is the 1973, I think, yes. And she dismissed the idea. Now, I had just come back from California, where I'd been looking at a voucher program, and my head was stuffed full of facts and views, opinions, and examples about vouchers. So I told her she was wrong. She gave reasons. I attacked them. She responded. There was the whole lunch was really dominated by our debate, our discussion. And when she left the room, the whole room fell about laughing, knowing that I was the only conservative and that I was the person who had the row with her. But in fact, if I'd calculated the occasion in order to advance my interests, I couldn't have done better, because Mrs. Thatcher liked argument, and she liked people who argued with her. She liked to see if they could stand up their opinions with arguments and facts. So from that point on, we kind of knew each other. Now, I wrote sketches which sometimes were quite hostile to her in the Daily Telegraph, but that didn't seem to affect her. She was quite professional in that regard. And so a few years later, when she was Prime Minister, I'd been in America. I came back and she noticed that I was writing again in England, and she told Brian Griffiths, who was who was the head of her policy unit and a good friend, let's try to get John in because we need someone to help write the manifesto. So I wrote the Tory manifesto. She invited me to become a member of the policy unit. I worked there from the end of 1986 until late 1988. But she asked me to stay on, or return, that is, to help her with speeches, with major speeches. And when she left office, she asked me to be one of the team of 4. She was one, Robin Harris, another, and I, and a researcher, Chris Collins, who produced the 2-volume manifesto, which we did over the next 3 years. Sorry, the 2-volume. Sorry, that's my phone going. It's annoying. The 2-volume memoirs, and they were actually a great publishing success, as well as, I think, a very good record. I think historians agree it's one of the best prime ministerial memoirs, which meant that I became, and my wife became a kind of family friends with the Thatchers, and that continued really until she died. The people were very loyal to Mrs. Thatcher, and she was loyal to them. And so I saw her only quite about a month or 2 before her death. She was obviously failing at that point, but she perked up whenever the conversation was interesting to her, and she was very lively. And I remember one of the people who was working for her came into the room. I was with Robin Harris and her former secretary, and she said, Mark Worthing, and then she said, "Oh, don't go. I'm having such fun." And so we said another half hour. The carer was trying to protect her because she felt she was tired, but she was in fact capable of suddenly arousing herself from a kind of a dream, and she giving as good as she got, and then she'd lapse back into it. But I think the picture of her in old age, given by the film with Meryl Streep, is a very accurate picture. And I think anyone who sees that movie, and this is partly due to Miss Streep's very, very brilliant performance, both as the middle-aged Mrs. Thatcher on top of government and running things, and later as the somewhat frail old lady who's trying to remember what happened in her life. Both sides of that picture are very brilliantly portrayed, and I think you can't see that film without being admiring of her in her great times and sympathetic to her towards the end. It's quite an effective movie, and one that is, your viewer, if anyone who sees it, will find it powerful.
I think it's very interesting because if I understand it right, the intention of the playwright and the intention of the movie director were originally quite different. But in a sense, it's the power of the story which made the film. So whatever their intention, whatever their political views, they ended up producing a fairer picture of Mrs. Thatcher. You said that she loved an argument. And of course, there are plenty of myths around Mrs. Thatcher, but perhaps one of the most persistent one is that she didn't like arguments, that she was bossy, basically single-minded, and she never liked, the sort of open discussion and political disagreement that you described before. So how would you describe her style of leadership, particularly as seen as within the policy unit, within the group of people that work with her more closely?
I want to emphasize again what you just said is completely correct, that she did like arguments, so much so that she didn't always appreciate other people didn't quite enjoy argument as much as she did. And one of my colleagues said to me once, a new advisor came in to talk to her, and obviously somewhat nervous at meeting the Prime Minister for the first time. Well, she launched into her normal cross-examination of experts, and as my friend put it, as his body was being carried out, she turned to me and said, "Why do people take everything I say so seriously?" Of course, her view was this, and this is the people who work for her, I think, would all agree with what I've said, what I say here. We used to say she kicked up and she kissed down. That is to say, the people who work for her in humble roles, and the detectives whose roles were not at all humble, nothing she could do, and they could do nothing wrong, and she could not be more kind and helpful towards them. So much so that on one famous occasion, when a waitress slipped and poured soup into the lap of the Foreign Secretary, Mrs. Thatcher jumped up and comforted the girl, saying, "You mustn't be too upset about this," and so on. I think the Foreign Secretary felt that priority might have been misplaced. But then she was very tough with ministers and senior civil servants. She expected them to know the facts, the job. They were working for the British taxpayer, and they should demonstrate the fact to her. So she could be she was never, I think, rude to people, but she was very clear in demanding answers, in wanting to get the facts straight. She was a very straightforward person. She wasn't at all serpentine or attempting to gain her objectives by stealth. To some extent, she had to do that in the Falklands War, but nonetheless, she was a mixture of warrior and diplomat of a very effective kind. Suddenly, it was first of all to be very clear about what she wanted and what the policies were. She was very annoyed or irritated with when policies were vague and ambiguous, and when ministers didn't know how to defend them. And that's why her style of leadership in rhetoric was absolutely clear, so much so that she sometimes denounced different kinds of rhetoric. I think on one occasion, her ministers were urging an attitude of consolidation of her gains so far, rather than moving ahead to new objectives. And she made a political speech in which she said, "Who is going to rally to the sound of the word consolidation?" In order for policies to work, the people had to understand why they were being adopted, what the justifications for them were, and then she would then drive home that message by repetition again and again. And now people, in a sense, think of her as essentially somebody who was always saying the same thing. There is no alternative, Tina. But the fact is, she had thought about this, and she realized that if leadership seems uncertain, then it won't get any followers. And I think she was more or less correct. She is now seen as one of the greatest prime ministers. If she had been a much more ambivalent and ambiguous figure, I don't think that would be true.
John, is there an instance, an episode in which she did something that was totally surprising to you at the moment?
I'm sure there were such occasions. I know there were occasions, obviously, when the people who worked for her disagreed with her, but that's inevitable, it seems to me. The famous remark, "No man is a hero to his valet," to which, of course, the response came from Hegel, I think. That is true, but not because the hero is not a hero, but because the valet is a valet. And I think we all tend, when we're working with powerful and strong figures, we tend to get irritated when they don't always take our advice. But in retrospect, you can see why that happened, and actually you can see that you were on that occasion wrong. So so there were, of course, occasions in which, we were like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, off in the wings muttering and complaining. But in general, I think we were there because we were persuaded of the general correctness of her policies, and so there was never any problems. I do think just before one election, she was upset about the way the campaign was going, and we did have arguments which were quite strong about the way in which policies were going to be presented in speeches. But frankly, in retrospect, that moment was a bit of panic on everybody's part, and it passed. Of course, with ministers, there were rows on that topic at that time, and they got into the papers. But the fact was, we were going to win that election, almost as if we'd spent the entire campaign sleeping on the beach. What happens on these occasions is people are on edge. They wonder if they're misreading everything. And you do get these kind of mistaken, I think it was called wobbly Thursday. You get these kind of things. But apart from that, although obviously sometimes Mrs. Thatcher and some of her advisors disagreed, nonetheless, in the main, there was a strong sense of mission in the Downing Street of the Thatcher years, which hasn't always been there since.
Well, in many ways, Thatcherism is remarkable also because it's still controversial today, including within the Tory party. I mean, there is an almost endless list of Tory MPs that from time to time come up and say, we must renounce Thatcherism, which by and large, unfortunately, the Tory party did. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is her more lasting achievement? And what do you think she thought was her more lasting achievement?
We know what she wanted to achieve, and I think she felt she had achieved it. On the final last 2 days, I think, of the 79 election campaign, which was the first election she won, she was interviewed by a television interviewer, and because the campaign was for practical purposes over, she, in a sense, felt relaxed enough to really, so to speak, not talk in a cautious way. And she said, "I can't bear Britain in decline. I simply can't bear it." Now, her policies, which she was expressing there, are that Thatcherism was essentially a program for the regeneration of Britain. Now, in the campaign and for a while afterwards, that was seen in terms of economic revival. The problems of Britain in 1978 and 9 were the problems of economic collapse, of high inflation, of excessive trade union power, and all of the issues seemed to be about the British disease, and which was an economic disease, and restoring, and her great drive was to restore economic prosperity and progress in Britain. Now, of course, that's what she did, and for the first 3 years, it was a very tough battle almost every day. There were strikes in the steel industry and the mines and so on. We didn't always win. She gave way in the first miners' strike because she calculated that she couldn't win it, and therefore she would postpone that battle until she could, and that's what happened. But although the first 3 years were dominated in most of our minds by these economic struggles and the defeat of inflation in particular, the Falklands War came along too. Now, she hadn't bargained for that, but a policy, if you have a politics of national revival and there's a military challenge to you, that's not something you can simply walk away from. And she realized that. And so for a matter of 3 months in the middle of 1980, 1982, the British politics revolved around the Falklands War, and the likelihood that she would win that war, which she did outright, was very modest. Nobody, I mean, most people didn't think that Britain could win that war. They just didn't believe it. And that was how far, in a sense, the national malaise had gone. Even in their heart of hearts, people felt the country was finished. Well, she demonstrated that it wasn't. And of course, giving the support she gave to the army and the navy and the armed forces in general meant that they performed well. And I think later on the military commander says they couldn't have wished for a better political leader if you're fighting a war, which meant she didn't take all the decisions themselves, but she took the hard ones and she backed them in the decisions they took. The end of that war, she had already established that the country was on the road back to being a more important country and also being a more prosperous one, because during that war, the economic indicators turned. That was the moment when things began to change. You could see that her economic policies were paying off. And so really from that point on, and then I would say, at that point on, she established the new politics. And the new politics of Thatcherism became the political and economic common sense of the country for actually about, I would say, for the next 25 years. Now, there was a second moment too, and that was the miners' strike, the second miners' strike, which she won again, hands down. And that meant that any domestic challenge to the politics that she'd established as the common sense of the country was going to go nowhere. The challenge had been made, it had been a strong one, it had been clearly defeated. Those two victories explain a great deal about Mrs. Thatcher's place in history and about what she wanted to achieve and what she in fact did achieve.
I think, to me at least, the political thinking of Mrs. Thatcher is intertwined with the issue of self-reliance. I mean, of bringing back in the British environment, Victorian values or virtues to an extent which was in many ways, I think, unthinkable and surprising. I mean, she in a sense, she was engaged in a cultural war of sorts.
Yes.
And so when it comes to that, when it comes to this issue of culture and ideas, before letting you go, I would like to ask you something about the role of intellectuals in Thatcherism. So clearly, Mrs. Thatcher, because of her repetitiveness that you mentioned before, because of Tina and so on and so forth, because of intellectuals typically hating free market types, is seen as an anti-intellectual leader par excellence. But in many ways, she was always interested in ideas. She was, part of a think tank scene in the UK well before becoming powerful. She was well known to the Institute of Economic Affairs. She's established the Center for Policy Study. She was clearly in friendly relationship with London School of Economics professors such as Michael Oakeshott or Ken Minogue. So I would like to ask you, how much can we consider Thatcher to be a product of such a cultural environment? And if so, what's the lesson which is there for think tanks like Istituto Bruno Leoni?
Well, as you say, think tanks were very important for her. She founded the Center for Policy Studies with Keith Joseph, and that were launched well, I'm sorry, I should say that the IEA launched the economic rethinking that became Thatcherism in Britain, but she knew the IEA well. In fact, Ralph Harris told me, Lord Harris, who was the Director General of it, he told me that back in the height of Macmillanism, when he'd introduced economic planning and fundamentally inflationary policy, there was a meeting Ralph called together of those Tory MPs whom he thought were solid on economic policy and were good free marketeers. Well, there's only about 20, and one of them was this woman, and the tone of the meeting, Ralph told me, was extremely depressive. Oh, well, it looks as though Harold's established the party back in the old high Tory way, with a kind of no real economic policy and a willingness to tolerate inflation to keep people happy and so on. And then apparently this woman, who was of course Mrs. Thatcher, said, "Look, this is all nonsense," she said. If you cannot convince people that Marks and Spencer do a better job for the consumer than the post office, you shouldn't be in the circus." And he said this really did rally people. And of course, I think that was the impact she had again and again. Now, she was also somebody who had imbibed a kind of common sense economic liberalism, classical liberalism, as the daughter of a shopkeeper. And there is a romance, you know, in a way in shopkeeping, because if you're running a greengrocer's store, for example, and I remember my mother saying these kind of things to me. Oh yes, they've got some sultanas in from Patmos. They're the best, you know. And so people did have a sense that if they were growing up before the Second World War, that Britain was a vast entrepot. There were goods coming in and goods going out. And she did have a sense that Britain was in a kind of mercantile sense, the center of the world. And that gave her a kind of idea of a rough and ready kind about free enterprise and market economics. But she then, you know, she didn't just have that idea. She then went to work to justify having that idea. She wanted to know the solid arguments. That's why the moment she realized that she was going to be a major figure in the politics of the country, she immediately contacted, through Ralph and Arthur at the IEA, people like Friedman, people like Hayek. And she, on one occasion, literally sat at Hayek's feet. And there was Professor, I think, Karl Brunner in Switzerland. There was a series of people whom she regarded as her economic gurus and whom she consulted. And she was all her life an eager scholarship girl, trying to, in a sense, master the next topic on the agenda. And that explains a great deal about her. So she was aware of the school. I mean, let me put it this way: when she was accused of being a Manchester liberal, she would make the point that the Anglo-Scottish tradition in economics was clearly the dominant tradition, not only in Britain, in fact, in the world. It was the mainstream tradition, and it had been produced very largely in Scotland and England. And so she wasn't importing some a new doctrine from abroad. She was returning to one of the most powerful intellectual traditions in British life. Now, why do I say that? Because it is also fair to say that Thatcherism wasn't just economics. As I said, it was about the regeneration of Britain. But she sensed she believed two things. One is she thought that the Victorian virtues that you mentioned, what Shirley Letwin in her book called the vigorous virtues, which are necessary for a society to work, and so that self-reliant people can then assist others who are not able, for reasons of luck or ill fortune, to be self-reliant, need our help. That can't, the sentimental virtues, the virtues of charity and compassion, they are not very helpful unless there are self-reliant people around to exhibit them. and to get self-reliant people, you need the vigorous virtues too. And that's a very important element in the kind of moral argument of Thatcherism, which you were referring to before. So, and the third point I would say is nationalism. Mrs. Thatcher was a British patriot. Whether you call her a nationalist, it seems to me as it's a word. There's a debate about the meanings of the word nationalism and patriotism, but she was certainly somebody who was actuated by love of country and the need for the country to exhibit the same vigorous virtues that she wanted in the British people. Now, when she was accused, as she sometimes was, of not realizing that not realizing the dangers of nationalism, she would say, look, in the Second World War, Hitler invaded and conquered other countries, and you think that's nationalism. She regarded that as a form of racial nationalism, actually, of racial imperialism. But she went on to say, look at the people who resisted. Why did they resist? They resisted for a number of reasons, but one of them was certainly love of country. The French who formed the French people who formed the resistance, they included Gaullists and communists, but the communists were certainly French patriots on that occasion, as were the Gaullists. So she thought it was oversimple to see nationalism in negative terms. And she certainly thought she had to draw upon not only the vigorous virtues, not only the tradition of Anglo-Scottish classical economic liberalism, but also the British the stream of British patriotism, which is an important part of English life, and in which she was able to recruit for her purposes.
John, thank you very much for sharing your memories and your thoughts with us in this occasion of the anniversary of Mrs. Thatcher passing. Thank you very much again. Io ringrazio molto chi ha seguito questa conversazione dell'Istituto Bruno Leoni. Finisco solo con un ricordo. C'è una frase che viene usata anche molto nel film con Meryl Streep, no? Adesso, dice la signora Thatcher, tutti vogliono diventare qualcuno, noi volevamo fare qualcosa. E curiosamente anche il presidente Reagan, tra le sue citazioni più famose, ce n'è una che dice sostanzialmente non c'è limite a quanto puoi fare di buono se non ti interessa troppo chi se ne prende il merito. Ecco, in un mondo di politici influencer, forse queste due frasi ci aiutano a mettere in prospettiva figure come queste, che non a caso sono ancora ricordate oggi come delle persone che hanno lasciato un segno nella storia del secondo Novecento e anche nella storia del travagliato rapporto tra Stato e mercato. Grazie ancora per la vostra attenzione.
Thank you very much.